Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Luiza Savage, Executive Editor for Growth at POLITICO, and it is my pleasure to introduce the Global Affairs President, Mr. President, Kent Walker of Google. It's wonderful to have you here. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
It's Kent's first Halifax Forum. Welcome. I'm really excited about this conversation, but I don't know if I should be more excited or terrified. We're here to talk about one of the new eras that Peter mentioned, and that is the era of AI. We're here to talk about democracies and the threats and the opportunities for them. And I think I wanted just to start, Kent, you're at one of the leading companies driving the AI revolution around the world. What do you see as the threats to democracy from AI? We know about disinformation, we know about cyber attacks. So what's the biggest threat on your mind? And what do democracies need to do to really confront these threats?
So as you think about the rise of technology, I started by remembering that video we saw about the landings in Normandy to start off the conference yesterday. And that notion, that brought me back to an HBO video called Band of Brothers that some of you may have seen. Toward the end of that series, there was an episode where American soldiers were driving down the road and seeing a column of German soldiers who had surrendered with horses and carts behind them. And one of the American soldiers looks out at the column of German soldiers, and I'll clean up the language a little bit here, and says, "You so-and-sos, you had horses and wagons, and we had Ford and General frigging Motors. How did you think you were going to win?" And I think, in a sense, now, our adversaries around the world don't have horses and wagons. They have access to some of the same advanced technologies that we have. My dad, who was in the service for many years, said that in the Second World War, the Germans had a phrase, "Sweat saves blood." But the Americans had a better phrase, "Machines save men." And the machines of today are, just as much as they are tanks and planes, they are cyber and digital and AI. So how do we make sure that we stay ahead in this race at a time when so much of the research is being done on the private side rather than the government side? So I think we're seeing challenges. I'm happy to go into them with regard to cybersecurity with AI and the like. But we can also talk about the potential of AI to make sure we stay ahead in that race.
100%, and I'd love to get into all of that. But I do want to start with the threats, right? We've seen hostile actors using disinformation, cyber attacks, deep threats. How do you protect your platforms, YouTube, for example, from being used in disinformation campaigns? And why does it sometimes fail? Like, what needs to change to keep up with these efforts by Russia, by China, Iran, others? Yeah, North Korea, you had a North Korea attack.
Absolutely. I mean, we take this responsibility very seriously. We think of Google as the company that's keeping more people safe online than pretty much any other organization out there. But that requires constant vigilance. We're seeing an increasing number of cyber attacks. The NATO countries alone have seen a quadrupling in cyber attacks in the last few years. There's a constant drumbeat of foreign influence operations. This last year, where we saw roughly half the planet voting, we saw a series of efforts to interfere with elections. But the good news is, so far, AI has been in experimental phase for the bad actors that are out there. They have not yet broken the code on how to put this to work all that effectively. Vladimir Putin is finding out it's harder than you might think to become a social influencer. And so the good news is that we're using AI as a defense as well, both on the cyber side and on the misinformation and disinformation side.
We'll talk about that a little bit.
Yeah. On the cyber side, we just had in the last couple of weeks the first use of AI to discover a vulnerability in the wild that has never been found by people before. We found Google accounted for roughly 30% of all the vulnerabilities we found out in the wild just in the course of the last year alone. And we're continuing to ramp that up and finding vulnerabilities in open source software, et cetera. So we're patching the holes in our defenses, and AI is helping us do that. When it comes to foreign propaganda, which is a serious challenge. You know, when we took RT, Russia Today, off of YouTube, We saw that they moved their base of operations to the global south, to Africa, to tell their story more effectively. But there too, AI is helping. A few years ago, YouTube was able to, about 1 view in 100 on YouTube violated our policies. Today, it's 1 view in 1,000. And that's because we're using AI, which can identify some of these problematic kinds of content faster, more consistently, more thoroughly than even our tens of thousands of reviewers can. So, please.
Yeah, so one piece is the threats, the cyber threats, the attacks, the disinformation. The other piece is the competition, right? So there are only 2 countries in the world that can produce AI at scale, and that's the United States and China. So we hear a lot in Washington about the competition with China. I feel like just about every topic right now is being situated in that issue. So I want to talk for a few minutes about what it will take both proactively and defensively to stay ahead in that competition for AI. And I want to start first with the proactive piece. It's been just striking to me how just in the last couple of weeks, we are hearing energy policy being talked about not as we need to drill, baby drill to drive down prices, like we're hearing that, but we're also hearing we need to accelerate the permitting of energy infrastructure to support data centers so that we can be competitive against China and AI. And I don't think that's really an argument we heard even a year ago that often. So what do we need to do? What is your vision at Google for what the United States needs to do proactively to maintain its competitive position in AI against China?
So to start with the first part of your question, the race is very real. China has announced its AI Plus program. They are investing tens of billions of dollars in doing this, right? And there are security implications as well. We learned a month ago that China was actually using open source models from the United States for the People's Liberation Army. We learned just a week ago that some of China's open source models are now at or above the level of American open source models. So we really are in this neck and neck competition. Now, the second part of your question.
Can we just stop right there? How close is the competition? You say neck and, is it really neck and neck?
I think we would have said, a year or two ago that we were months ahead, but maybe not years ahead. Today, I think there are different areas in which different countries have advantages. For machine vision technology, for example, China has made significant strides, and we're seeing them piggyback off innovations that have been made elsewhere to accelerate the work that they're doing. And it's not just China, I should say. When we open source models, there are a whole variety of people who have access to these different tools. And so it's a growing concern. Now, the second part of your question is, if anything, even more important, which is, what do we do about it? And there, I think the key is a combination of continued research. And it's remarkable, a generation ago, the large majority of R&D in the United States was done by the federal government. Now the large majority is actually done by the private sector. So how, we talk about nuclear back in the day as having been born classified. AI was effectively born private. So how do we make sure that we are aligning the work of democracies and democratic governments and this private sector innovation? And there's a lot of work that can be done, better procurement to make sure that we're actually putting these tools to work. The line in the valley is technology races are typically not won by the first to invent, but by the best countries to deploy. Well, how do we put this to work so we're actually making progress? Data and big picture scientific advances as well as day-to-day work. Then we need regulatory structures that actually align. Canada, the United States, for example, as part of a North American alignment, would benefit from having harmonized AI regulations in the same way that we have harmonized food safety regulations or harmonized automobile regulations. So I think there's a lot that can be done there. And then finally, I think you want to make sure you have a pro-innovation agenda. So you're taking the responsibility side seriously. You're dealing with specific challenges like deepfakes or impersonation that are unique to AI. But you also recognize that we have a lot of existing laws on the books that already address issues of fraud and the like. And you want to make sure that you take a balanced approach that recognizes this is a generational breakthrough in technology. This is not just a scientific breakthrough. This is a breakthrough in the way we make breakthroughs. And that's what's opening up these dramatic new vistas in healthcare, in nuclear fusion, in clean water around the world, in material science. That's really where the revolution is going to be. If I could tell just one quick story on that. You may have heard about our AlphaFold technology. This was humanity had sequenced DNA, human DNA, 20 years ago. But just knowing the order of those letters didn't actually turn out to be as helpful as you might have thought. What you really needed to understand was how the proteins expressed themselves, how they folded. So if a COVID virus had these kinds of spikes, you needed this kind of vaccine. If it has these kinds of spikes, you need this kind of vaccine. The problem was there are 200 million proteins out there. And each one of those proteins took a biology PhD student a full thesis, 3 or 4 years, to sequence just one protein. Our DeepMind team went to work and sequenced all 200 million of them in a couple of months. That's like taking every man, woman, and child in North America, training them up to be a biology PhD student, and having them do nothing but fold proteins for a couple of years. And now you have more than 2 million researchers around the world using these tools for drug discovery, for diagnosis, and the like. Imagine that kind of generational change in all of these other areas. That's why we think this is a golden era for science. And so we need a regulatory framework that encourages and promotes that while still being aware of the risks and making sure we have safeguards in place.
Mm-hmm. Before we get to the regulatory piece, I can't help but feel that we're going to look back, and tell me if you agree with this, in 2 or 3 years and say, actually, this moment, even though all the Trump stuff's in the headlines, but this was the moment where Silicon Valley went from being kind of on the other coast, trying to keep Washington out of their business, out of their hair, showing up occasionally, but mostly pushing to like, just don't regulate too much, to wanting to be at the center of some important policy decisions. And I mentioned energy, which I think is fascinating, this idea that OpenAI has brought a blueprint to the government saying, we need you to permit energy infrastructure and permit more nuclear, small reactors, et cetera. Do you feel that this moment calls for like a real shift in the way tech industry interacts with government?
I very much do. Energy is a great example. For example, we now have commissioned the first contract for small modular reactors in the United States. They're going to be in Oak Ridge, Tennessee, coming online. How do you expand the energy pie in a way that allows these data centers to be able to be successful? But that's just one small part of it. You're also looking at ways that governments and the private sector can bridge the gap a little bit. A lot of people in the Pentagon may never have met a computer scientist, and a lot of our computer scientists may never have met somebody in uniform. We need to make sure that there's a deeper understanding of the mutual needs there and what each can contribute. And then more broadly, think of the big ticket challenges that governments around the world face with the Sustainable Development Goals from the United Nations or the very real challenges to national security. We think technology is going to play a key part in making significant progress there. So you're right. I think in the early days, the Valley had something of a libertarian orientation to how we approach these issues. I think as the companies have matured, they recognize they both want to and are obliged to be a part of that conversation and figure out how we can contribute.
Mm-hmm. So the outgoing administration was working on these safety institutes and Congress was starting to work on AI legislation. I'm sure Senator Klobuchar will talk more about that on the next panel, but I'm wondering, was that the right approach, and what kind of regulatory framework do you think will meet the needs of both the public interest, safe AI, but also not, as you were mentioning before, squelching innovation?
Well, so we've been supportive of the AI safety institutes. We and others in the industry have said, look, it's too important an international conversation for the US not to have a representative in that conversation. But at the same time, we want to make sure that it's, again, a balanced regime that is internationally aligned. The G7, the OECD are already working on frameworks that have been sensible and well-grounded. We want to make sure that it is looking at both risks and opportunities. There's sometimes a regulatory tendency to look just at the risks and not think about how to accelerate. would say Senator Schumer in the United States had a series of insight forums where they brought a wide variety of different sectors, labor, academia, business, government, together to talk about all the different issues we're seeing with AI. And that was actually a really good foundation for thoughtful lawmaking. And I think you're going to see a series of bills coming out of that in the next, probably at this point, in the next session of Congress. We hope that it will address real and specific challenges in a comprehensive way and in a way that Canada and other countries would align with.
What do you think is the biggest challenge that legislation needs to address?
Fundamentally right now, and I think the first bills you're seeing in the US Congress, is how do we encourage a democratization of AI? So there's something called the National AI Research Resource, which would fund colleges throughout the United States to have more people researching cutting-edge AI and understand how to put it to work. At the same time, we have to make sure that we have the specific issues where you're seeing AI create new categories of challenges. Again, deep fakes or impersonations or some of this synthetic media that's manipulating or deceptive. Grandparents getting calls from supposedly their grandchildren to scam them out of money. I think you need to find frameworks to discourage that kind of activity. But the private sector also has a responsibility here as well. So we've put forward something called SynthID, which is a watermarking tool that now works across video, image, audio, and now text, at least longer bodies of text, to watermark any content that's coming out of Google's tools. The harder part of the watermarking is half the battle. The harder part is provenance. How do you detect any content from anybody that's coming onto your services? And there, too, we're working across the industry with a group called C2PA, which is founded by Amazon. We're now on the steering committee to make sure that at least all the largest platforms, and hopefully all the platforms, will be aligned in identifying deepfake kinds of material so that we can keep it off our platforms, or at least label it so people know what they're saying.
And I want to move to the defensive piece of this with regard to China. So there's a number of proposals going through the US Congress about restrictions on investing in China, on import controls, export controls. What does that look like from Google's perspective? You have complicated supply chains. If we're trying to keep China out of our supply chains and we're trying to restrict commerce with China in some of these technologies, does that help or hinder your ability to compete and develop?
It's very challenging from the perspective of the US government or other governments that are putting export limitations on. On the one hand, it's understandable, and it's one of the traditional tools in the toolkit to keep adversaries from gaining technological leads. On the other hand, most of our export controls are focused on material goods, hard things that you can touch and feel and block. Those can be leaky, as we know. We've seen, as I mentioned before, when the PLA is using open source tools, or when the Chinese government is developing its own models. Those models are largely, we believe, being made with non-export controlled chips. But if you harness together enough of the last generation chips, you can now apparently achieve just about generational, current generation performance. So a lot of the advances we're seeing is a little less about the chips and a little more about the algorithms. And that's been very traditionally difficult to put export controls around because you can't keep the whiteboard content secret. You can't keep the academic paper secret. We at Google are having published an awful lot over the years. We've published more around AI than Harvard, Stanford, Caltech, and MIT combined. But we're taking a more careful view of what we're publishing as we get to these more advanced models. We have not open sourced our most advanced models. We have open sourced some smaller models. But it's a delicate balance, and we are working through and talking with government about what the right structure should look like.
Mm-hmm. Speaking of the government, there's a new administration coming in, and I wanted to ask you a little bit about what you expect from them on a couple different fronts. The first one being regulation. Are you expecting now a sort of a ratcheting back of attempts to regulate the sector? Would it be fair to say?
Well, I think it'll be a different approach. The Trump administration, the first Trump administration, had its own executive order around AI. It was one of the first pronouncements around AI. And Michael Kratsios, who was the chief technology officer of the United States at that point, has is now a co-chair of the Trump Tech Transition Team. And he recently made some comments about the need for democracies to both protect and promote. So protect to make sure that we have export controls, that we stay ahead in terms of the leakage of technology, but also promote. Recognize that we can't take our foot off the gas pedal in terms of accelerating our progress here. So I think their approach will be along those lines, if I had to guess. I strongly suspect there'll be aspects of the Biden administration executive order that they redo. But I think there may be other elements, perhaps the AI Safety Institute or having chief AI officers for the various federal agencies for each department that might be perfectly sensible and they might continue.
On antitrust, so the Trump administration has actually shown a strong interest in cracking down on big tech on account of monopolistic behavior. Google's obviously facing actions from DOJ on that front. Do you expect that Trump will continue down that road, or will he pull back on this Department of Justice process with Google?
It's hard to know, and obviously the old line in Washington is personnel is policy, and we'll have a better sense once we have a more full idea of what the new administration looks like and what their priorities are. But our concern in this is that, as I said before, Google is a company that keeps more people safe online than anybody else out there. We think that when you're looking at the scale of the geopolitical challenges that we're facing, some people may say that big is bad. Sometimes big may be necessary to help us all address some of these issues. And some of the proposals that the Department of Justice recently put out, we think would actually be challenging from a security perspective, forcing us to turn over your search history to domestic and foreign companies that you might not have confidence in, keeping us from being able to invest in AI at a time when investments in AI have never been more important. Even potentially breaking up the parts of our integrated services. Our Chrome browser, for example, benefits from the work of Mandiant, of Google Threat Intelligence, of other signals we get across our services to avoid malware, to avoid bad actors, to keep people safe. So we're going to be making our own proposals around that in December, and hopefully be more tightly grounded in what the case was actually about, and more focused on the notion that any changes need to keep issues of safety and security and privacy front and center.
And speaking of the Trump administration, Elon Musk was a founder of OpenAI. He then broke with them and has been critical. But he has this very interesting insider role in the new administration. And one of them is leading this Department of Government Efficiency. He wants to slash the size of the federal government. And I'm genuinely curious, do you think that using AI would be a path to significant workforce reductions in the federal government?
I think AI has proven to be very promising in being able to do things more efficiently and more effectively. So I've talked about on service like YouTube being able to go dramatic expansions in the amount of disinformation we can see. We still have tens of thousands of people working on this problem. So we haven't used it to slash our workforce so much as we have used it to make our workforce more efficient and more effective. We see the same with regard to computer coding. At Google, we have 25% of our code today is written by AI. We still have as many computer scientists as we did before. They're just adding value on top of that. The AI is taking care of the more routine code. They're coming up with new products and features and services. So you can imagine AI being a tool for any government to do better at delivering whatever services it wants to provide its citizens.
So I'm going to invite people to think about their questions and raise their hand if they have one. And in the meantime, I want to ask you sort of like a big picture science fiction-y question. Last night here at the forum, I was speaking with someone from the Pentagon who said, it's just a matter of time before you all build an AI that's better than humans at most tasks and can eventually do its own research to improve itself even more. How do we ensure that the AI itself doesn't become the threat to democracy? How do we actually align it with our values?
Yeah.
I mean, and how far away is that moment?
It's a ways off, I think.
Can you quantify a ways?
No, well, there are
months?
different people in the industry who have very different views of this. But I will say the core problem is one of the alignment problem in computer science. How do you make sure whenever you ask any kind of algorithm or tool to do a certain thing, that it's doing those things within the boundaries that you set in ways that you would prefer? And that's a continuing area of research as we start to get into agentic behavior, where you're not just asking for a piece of information, but you're asking for a research report. Or you're not just asking for a research report, but you're asking for the tool to book you tickets for dinner tomorrow night. You want to make sure that it's doing the right thing and not inadvertently creating challenges. There are computer science ways of putting guardrails around that. We are looking at ways of making sure how do we double check and red team these tools so that we understand before we put any tool in the marketplace that it's safe and secure for people to use. An example of that is even in Google search, we've started to introduce AI overviews in some searches. But we're being very careful about that because 7% of the queries we get every day at Google are healthcare queries. We don't want a hallucinated AI answer to the question of what's the right dosage of Tylenol for a 6-month-old, or I'm having a heart attack, what should I do? So as we do that in a secure and responsible way, we're pushing the boundaries, but we want to be pushing the boundaries in a constructive way. So I'm optimistic that we'll be able to use these tools as we use many other tools that have, they're subject to abuse, that's right. But if we do it in a way that builds in security by design, safety by design, the benefits will vastly outweigh the potential downsides.
There's a question right here.
Please.
I'm Ayman Manna from a press freedom organization based in Beirut. My question is about your work. Can you tell us more about your work with other languages? I'm not talking only about very small languages, or not spoken by a large amount of people, but even Spanish, Arabic. The level of harmful content, proportionally, hateful content, disinformation in these languages that is still available on the platform is much higher than in English.
Yes.
What is being done? How are you engaging with local civil society organizations, with your engineers, and with what AI allows to actually make sure that everyone is safe and not only English speakers are safe? Thank you.
Let me start with a short story about AI and language, and then come back to your question of how we're making sure that this is safe for people. The story of modern AI, these large language models, comes out of search and comes out of the challenge of taking a query and understanding everything on the web. So that you start out by understanding misspellings. So we had Google Spell Check. And then you had to understand synonyms and differences. If someone searches for bark, are they looking for the bark of a tree or the bark of a dog? Then you have related searches, where you actually have to have a knowledge graph, and you understand the meaning of the king of France versus the queen of England. And now you have to understand gender and class and nationality and history. So we created the knowledge graph, notion of related searches. In 2012, we put out a paper called Word to Vector, which basically create a word cloud of every word in the English language, 10,000 parameters. We parameterized language, the engineers would say. It's like in the old days, Roget's thesaurus wasn't organized alphabetically, it was organized by sections. So you'd have verbs of motion over here and colors over there. We did that with language. And that made language a mathematics exercise. A big mathematics exercise, but we're pretty good at big math problems, especially with the data centers we have. That's what then led to ChatGPT and the paper that we put out in 2017 called Attention is All You Need, which basically looked not just at words or sentences or paragraphs, but pages or books. And that context allowed us to excavate the knowledge, the expertise that's embedded in all the content that people have ever created. And now coming to your question, all of that content is not in English. It's in 1,000 languages, literally 1,000 languages around the world. Google Translate, using these tools in 2017, went from being not great at about a dozen languages, maybe the level of a 6-year-old, better than nothing, but not fantastic, to the level of a 16-year-old. Pretty good, maybe not perfect, but better than I could do on my own. Now it's for a dozen languages, and then 40 languages, and then 100 languages. And today we're up to 342 languages. And we want to get to 1,000 languages, the languages that might still be spoken by a couple million people around the world, to make sure they're part of this global community, that they can benefit from all of the knowledges in all of the languages. And now finally, back to your question. How do you make sure that the content in all of those languages is being reviewed and tested and assessed? The answer we give today is that we work hard to hire not just native speakers of those languages, but often people who are in region, who will understand the latest slang, the latest ways of trying to circumvent our safeguards, and the guardrails we put in place. That's not a bad answer, but as you say, it's an imperfect answer, because sometimes things slip through in ways that we would prefer not to happen. Now, we invest a lot. We have between Google and YouTube, we have between 40 and 50,000 people working on versions of this problem and trying to avoid spam and malware and fraudulent ads and various other things. But even with all of those people, it's imperfect. We think AI is actually a roadmap for us to get even better, because we will understand the way a native speaker understands what's going on in these languages. And we will still use people at the cutting edge to understand the very latest developments we're seeing and help train the AI to get even better.
Thank you, Kent. The bad news is we're already out of time. I know there are so many questions here, but the good news is the next panel is also on AI. So you'll be able to pose your questions to them. But I will ask everyone to please stay in your seat because they're coming right up. Thank you so much.